Okay, so we are here today to check in with the work group, even though the entire work group is not here and we have an abbreviated schedule. I have on the screen the agenda we'll be reviewing. We're going to get an introduction from David about the current state of the upgrade overall. And we have a big question that we want to start shaping up. I think we're not trying to answer this question so much as figure out what questions we would need to answer in order to answer the question, and then how we will go get that information. That's the question about what would be the minimally necessary output representations for HSDS compliance and or HSDA compliance. Beyond that, we've developed an outline of the other remaining issues that you'll see here below those first two bullets. We're not going to get through all of this. We're just trying to shape up the remaining items on the agenda for this work group so that we can be hopefully drawing it to a close within the next month or two. Let's jump in. I'm going to pass things over to David to give us an overview of the current state of the 3.0 upgrade. And then we can pause for any quick questions, and then David, you can lead us into the discussion about the minimally necessary output representations.
Yeah.
All right.
Could you stop sharing, because it says that I can't share when you're sharing actually.
Okay, here we go.
There we go. Share my screen. Share. Can everybody see my screen?
Yep.
Yes.
That's good. So all I sort of wanted to give an overview is that when we're working with the specification in the repo, what the current state is. So this is the new, there's a new 3.0 dev branch, which is where all the new work for 3.0 is going. And within that, there's a schema folder, and the schema folder contains the JSON schemas, the new JSON schemas of one for each of the table definitions. There's also there's also that there continues to exist the data package.json, which is now generated off those schema definitions. And these schema definitions, if we look at like an example of one, say like service, this is all updated. So this is like how you would represent stuff in JSON schema, like it's like an equivalent to a table. And within this, there is also at the bottom, I'm just good. There's like references out to different tables. So if it like schedules, for example, is a list of schedules. So that's sort of how JSON schema sort of defines like references and relationships. And so this essentially says that schemas, for example, schedules are one-to-many relationship with service, and therefore we can then from this we can then imply lots of other things and have different we can generate all our different schemas from that. So that's where I'm hoping will be the canonical definitions of what the standard is. But we've got tooling as well, which makes compiled versions of these so they're easier to use, so they can put it all into like either one massive JSON schema or has particularly different versions of it. And like Skylar's request was to have a list of another representation, which I've called tabular for now, which is like essentially a dictionary with each of the key elements in, say, organization, and then it's got a list of the tables in them. So that's like a new representation that I've made in order to like further the later discussion as well. So we've got this representation, and for each of these the compiled representations and other ones as well, we've also got an example folder. If you go back to the top level, there's examples. And so in this, we've got like real examples of, say, the tabular version, for example. This is like what the tabular version, it's only got one organization or one program in for each, but it's like a representation of what that could look like. And there's also a JSON examples for all different types. So we've got like, if you wanted service a location at top level, if you wanted organization at the top level as well. And we've also got the simple versions of it where you don't, which is what Open Referral UK do, where they don't have any of the one-to-many relationships as well. So these are an example based on organization doesn't have anything because any other relationships. So that's quite a simple one. But other things have got Service Simple has got a few sort of one-to-one relationships. It says like what the organization is and what the program is and stuff. So these are like and all these stuff are basically generated from that schema directory, and there's a tool that I haven't got to show you which does all this generation, so that it will automatically make the examples for you, and it will make the compiled schema for you. So if we ever get to a point where we have like extensions and profiles, you can run the tool off the profile to make these new examples or to make the new sets of compiled schemas for you. So that's where we are. That's sort of where the work is at the moment, and alongside this 3.0 dev branch, there's also the docs here. So this is like if you go to the bottom there, so this maybe make it bigger because you can go to the 3.0 dev branch, and the data package.schema and stuff, the data package.json is used here to generate the docs, and these docs now got all the new fields in that we've specified in all our discussions. And it's either at the moment we could talk about deprecated later, but they've got like all the deprecated fields are now there, and we're marking them quite clearly and stuff. And so yes, and you've also got the latest like logical model, so it's generating the the new ERD diagrams for that as well. So that's something quite good to reference if you want to have a look at the state of that, if you want to look at it in that regard with that as well. So that's basically where we are. We haven't done much other changes to the documentation. It's still basically the old documentation with the new schema. So there's going to be lots of stuff we need to change there. And we need to put in the new examples into the docs. There's quite a lot of documentation work that needs to be done. But I think like, yeah, but we need to answer like the fundamental question next before we do too much of that stuff.
Merry Christmas. Wow, this is awesome.
Is that
that's good?
At least you're happy. That's
also
good.
I'm also happy with the ER diagram. I mean, I'd have to take a closer look, but like it's looking far less like a giant spaghetti monster.
I think
yeah,
there's some benefits to having like the metadata and stuff outside. Anyway, you can have a look at it, but yeah, and we should be able to generate the ERD diagrams off a particular profile, so every profile can have it as well. I think that should be fairly straightforward and stuff, but we haven't done all the code for that yet, but it's mostly there. So that's where we are. So
it's not going to be ready for Christmas, unfortunately, Skylar, but I've also got one of my colleagues looking at the ER diagrams and how we can just make them a bit more presentable and a bit more understandable and a bit more navigable and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So yeah, that'll come, but it'll be next year.
Man, this is incredible, guys. That's so exciting. I love this.
So David, go. I just want to hear from the folks, if you have any questions or observations just about what you've seen so far before we jump into the meat of the question that David wants to ask us. But David, was there anything more to share?
No, I think that's basically it. Yeah.
Just one question for clarification. When, I want to clarify when we go to make a change, which is, a big question, but just theoretically, step one is to change the root files in the schema directory. So that
this is the single source of truth, hopefully. So
cool.
you should do that. And then there's a tool, which is a command line tool at the moment, which we may automate to run against these, and it will generate the compiled schema and all the examples.
Yeah. And then I just super appreciate the tabular compiled version as well. So dictionary is perfect. That's exactly what we were thinking. So it's good, man.
So
man,
yeah,
beautiful.
So we can't necessarily have that as a canonical definition, which is what I was worried about, because of the way we need to have the refs somewhere. But these are quite sort of easy to read, basically. The single table files that have the refs that say how the relationships work.
Yep.
So yeah.
Agreed. we just had multiple feedbacks that like we'd like to be able to hit an endpoint and get a dictionary back for certain kinds of machine reading situations. So, but it doesn't
Okay,
matter
yeah.
whether it's primary or not. It's all about documentation. So it's
Yeah,
there.
exactly. Yeah. So that's what we'll come on to later in the representations discussion. Yeah. But any other questions about how this is structured? And
Okay.
Yeah, it looks, I agree, looks great. Nice, really nice work.
All right. So David, do you want to take us into the question, which I don't think we're going to be trying to answer. I think we're trying to hone the question in this call and figure out what questions we need to answer in order to answer the question. And then how are we going to go get that information?
okay, I don't know if it's necessarily going to be that controversial, but yeah,
Okay.
maybe I should share my screen. Should I share my screen back again? So
Yeah, go
I
for
got
it.
it. So maybe I should go through the what the main question that I'm trying to ask. Let's see if I can make this bigger. I can't get rid of that big notice anyway. So the question that I've got to ask, the big question that sort of I'm asking is like, we've got all the, especially with like a tabular representation now as well, we've got lots of different ways that you could express. People want to be able to publish HSDS in a plethora of different ways, and it's good having a plethora of different ways to do it, lots of different ways, but it's also, there's a downside to that because you have like interoperability stuff or federation more difficult. If people are all doing it in their own way, then it's harder to like link different or to have tooling around it, because it really like tooling for every single type of representation. So there's plus sides because it makes it easier to publish and we can have loads of different, and there's downsides, and we sort of need to sort of agree on where that's going to go. What representations do we allow? Are we very flexible about that? And what maybe do we build tooling for, or do we build tooling to convert one representation into another and all that kind of stuff? What do we do in future? So this was like, we need to define, I think we need to at least like have a suggestion, like a list or suggestion of ones that we do allow or don't allow, or I think to just leave it completely up to people to publish it in exactly the way they want is not great for interoperability. So we should, and it's also not great for new sort of implementation of HSDS to have some kind of like guidance about what they should be doing and what they shouldn't be doing. It's not good to just say, oh, you can just use our schema in any way you want and just go ahead and do it. It's not, I think that's not too great. So the question, so I've like compiled a list of what I think are sort of feasible output representations for this that we could consider. And the question I've got about these mainly is like, should we stop people from doing them or should we encourage them to do it? We need to sort of answer those questions about these representations. I'm really annoyed by that. One second. So the first representation here is a data package, like the old file data package. Do we agree that people can publish data packages? And I think it's been common consensus that because of backwards compatibility, we're definitely going to allow that. But I'm just saying that is the one that we've got. So no one's got, yeah. So the question is, does anybody have any complaints or anything about still allowing data packages as a representation? Any controversy there? The second and third representations are the ones we don't do at the moment, which I feel that other standards do, like 360 giving and open contracting. They allow people to produce like an endpoint where you download a big file of services or contracts, whatever you're doing, and and some of them do that in JSON lines format, which is a way to make it more streamable. And it's like, do we allow people to do that? Because we're not sort of saying that people can do that now, but could we document that as an option to say that people, and this is, we don't do it currently, so it's like a question whether we want to do it, but pretty much every other sort of open data standard that I know of allows representation as like a big dump of JSON.
Well, given that both of those will be accessible, including the fully nested version via the API endpoints, I feel like people are going to innately have the ability to do that if they want to. And if we add a validation endpoint for each of those endpoints as well for when you're posting data back in. I mean, APIs kind of already self-validate to a certain extent because they only take a specific shape for input
Yeah.
anyway. You have to post a specific thing. So insofar as people are interacting with these through the APIs, then, you know, it's kind of enforcing that standard anyway. So that's just what comes to mind first, I suppose.
Yeah, because I don't see a reason not to have, say for service, I don't see a reason that somebody couldn't publish JSON lines of all their services, for example, like a JSON as their API, as like something that. But the question is, like, do we say, is that acceptable? Are you publishing HSDS if you do that? And I would say it probably is acceptable.
Yeah, I think looking at this, you know, the data package is the non-API version. And maybe there's maybe we want to also make explicit, basically like data package non-API version, API version seems that we should both, yeah, services.json, organization.json, as well as the endpoint format seems to me like the API basically like would be the API spec. And that the tabular JSON stuff, I think we probably don't need, I'd imagine, but maybe is like a good note.
Well, my note would be that personally, I would never replicate data via the service or organization JSONs because they have a whole bunch of deduplication that has to happen. And like I'm getting, you know, if I go for service, then I'm getting loads of duplicate organizations essentially. And that's just a cleanup operation, which I will find a way around. Like it could be done, there's no problem with that, but I would do an alternative. If I had a wish list of how I would do this, it would probably be more tabular, where I at least get, you know, like the core tables, just straight up like dump this sucker plus all of its relations.
I think that's what the data package is.
So, okay.
So the data
well,
package,
yeah, but the data package isn't via API.
right. So I think what we should have here is data package as kind of the tabular format, basically, or like as like the HSDS canonical standard. And then we should have, you know, on the API, you know, service.json, organization.json, as well as endpoints for those, and also a way to fetch the tabular data package.
That'd be cool.
Yeah, because I personally don't see much of a difference. I know we sort of separate API from like the standard or from like the file-based one. I understand that's sort of what we've done. I suppose personally is that I don't see it that way. I see it as just they're all APIs. Even if you're giving a data package, it's an endpoint on a website where you're downloading that file, and also like a service.json or JSON lines is just an endpoint. And the API specification, I feel is about things that are beyond those representations, like pagination and other things that you may want to do, like rate limit. There's lots of stuff you could do with an API version of the standard that is like recommended how you would produce an API for it. But I still don't see a problem with like having a download where you've got the whole JSON like, and all that's all the publisher is doing is producing a service. Well,
I'd be pretty happy with that. If we could get the National Data Platform to enforce making their data available via CSVs, then my job is easy. But
yeah,
it's more complex. Getting people to adhere to the standard at that point, I suppose, is where it gets tricky. I run into cases where they're like, we'll do APIs, but we're not going to do any other kind of access. And I guess that's why I keep looking at it like, well, it's weird to me to try to replicate via API, but also that seems to be the only way that some of our big use cases in the US are willing to do it. So giving them some guidance on how to facilitate that is useful, I suppose.
So it sounds like Devin and Skylar share some initial perspectives on this. And they do work with somewhat different, ends of the spectrum. So that's encouraging. I'd certainly want to hear from folks in the UK about their perspective, but also, like, before we just get into like roundtable of opinions, David, I think we want to be assessing this decision based on like a set of different criteria, and those criteria may be more or less weighted, you know, if we had to get into it, right? There's the question of what's going to be the easiest to adopt, the question of what's going to be the easiest to validate, the question of what's going to be most effective for interoperability. And I think there may also be questions about like what sets us up to federation, which is more of a longer term goal than say adoption, which is like a short term urgent, you know, objective. There might be other criteria, you know, we'd have to look through the, you know, the use case document, but that's, I think, what I just rattled off. I don't know if it's exhaustive, but those are the big ones.
Yeah.
And there may be tension between them. I guess that's my question to you all. Are there trade-offs between those different criteria?
I mean, Devin, I'm just asking, you're saying we should separate out the data and the API in this?
I think in terms of the organization of this, yeah. Well, I think that anyone who, like, if I'm dealing with someone who doesn't deal with APIs and they're like, I want to make HSDS, then the API stuff is only going to confuse them. And not only that, it's also going to make them feel like maybe they're not doing HSDS. But they can, if they produce a data package, you know, then they should be able to validate that data package. And, you know, even if we're not talking about anything on the internet, right? Like if they were sitting in a cave somewhere, they should be able to come up with a data package, give it to me on a USB key, and I should be able to be like, yes, this is valid. And then
so my argument is that if they should be able to produce I understand that less people are familiar with JSON, but they should also be able to produce a list of JSON if they knew it on their USB stick to give to people. That's my slight argument, but my fire alarm has just gone off, which is terrible. 1 second, sorry.
Also, my 12:30 just got canceled. Other people are also dealing with sickness and absences, apparently. So here we go.
Can somebody? I can't seem to mute myself. Can somebody
I can
mute
you? Yeah, I can mute you.
Yeah, thank you.
No, actually, Rob has to mute you because I gave Rob the hosting duties.
I've muted you.
yeah, I mean, I'm not, you know, I'm open. I think this is kind of a policy question. I don't have a strong opinion either way. I think that what I've been doing and what I think we've been doing over the last few years is kind of using an HSDS data package zipped up. A zipped HSDS data package is kind of the data source. Like that is that unzip, like this one zip file is the data. And so, you know, adding the need to then generate some representation of that in JSON.
I wasn't saying a need to. I was just saying, is it a viable option for people that want to publish?
Oh, I think it is. I think it's definitely viable. I mean, I guess the question is like, what is the question? If the question is what is the minimum viable HSDS, I think that it would be either a data package or a service. I think any of these would work.
That's my argument.
JSON. I think any of them should work.
Agreed.
Basically.
But are there trade-offs? Are there risks of not having one and saying you can use any of these options? Are there trade-offs from that?
Maintenance cost. But I, you know, right, the maintaining multiple methods is the trade-off.
Yeah, like if our application had to be like, oh, where HSDS would have to generate, you know, API. It's basically making the software application that's holding this also generate APIs, which I don't think is necessary.
My personal 2 cents is like we should at least do the two. I think that keeping data package as a fundament is good. There's, you know, certain people are actually starting to adopt that methodology. For example, Peter Bonnell within Reach has just, like in the last couple of weeks, implemented the only strict usage of HSDS 2.1 that I know of that's based on compiling these data packages daily and running validation using open referrals on Validator and stuff. It's pretty cool. He you got it all working and really stuck with it.
Perfect time for HSDS 3 to come out.
Right, exactly. So, but anyway, I think it's worth keeping that. But I think that more new adopters are going to be going the API route. So, probably.
So there's maintenance costs for us, but
Yeah.
if somebody publishes in a data package and we have all the tooling that we're talking about needing, then it's trivial to convert to JSON and vice versa.
No, it's true. It's not trivial. It depends on the application. It's definitely not trivial.
Yeah. Okay. The business use case might be that smaller organizations are probably going to be doing more like the data package, to Devin's point, because they don't have the resources to build a whole API layer. Enterprise use cases are almost exclusively going to be using the APIs because they're going to want to have the option for real-time updates and that kind of stuff. And if we're talking about doing, getting these two to talk to each other or interoperate, probably that in America's use case predominantly, that falls more into the category of like, okay, so we have a federated system that's trying to connect a bunch of points, and can it handle both? I'm like, well, it definitely should be able to handle both. And we're already in that territory, even just with Silo Buster in Washington State as a use case, right? Like, we're starting to get some of those via API, some of them via bulk daily dump, and some of them via spreadsheet. So it's up to the platform, implementers to figure out how to connect to the various data sources.
David, does this give you enough? Well, first of all, let me see if I'd like to hear from Dom and Ian if they're able to chime in before we try to synthesize this. If you all have anything to contribute, having listened to this back and forth.
I'll let Dom speak. I must admit, most of this is going over my head. So I rely on Mike. I'm sitting here listening just in case I can add any value, but at the moment, I don't think I can. But Dom might be a bit more technical than me.
Yes, I mean, it seems reasonable. I mean, the data package has done a good job so far of representing everything in a contained way. And I've built a lot of tools off that and extracted it, turned into a lot of different formats. But yeah, we can go to a different format if required.
Okay.
Of course, to keep them all in sync on our side, you can, or as an on the standard side, you can use a lot of existing tooling, either at least for transition or in the long term. I think the risk is around end user interoperability, and by end user I really mean the systems, not the person looking for help. That if you build a system that expects to be able to talk to an API and what you get is a data package that's not much use to you, my intuition would suggest that in most cases we actually have communities of people trying to interoperate around open referral standards, and they're going to have, hopefully, either going to have similar needs or ways of looking at the world, or are going to be able to negotiate with each other early enough on to be able to make these choices from a very small menu of choices, rather than just everyone publishing or using what they expect. But that is purely intuition. I have no evidence for that.
What if we make a tool that takes a data package and turns it into JSON or streams it out?
I
Right,
think
I mean, I
we
think
probably
that's
should do that.
inevitable, right? Like, that's basically inevitable. I think the question
I mean,
before us,
the whole
though,
question,
sorry.
the whole question about interoperability is, we've got a tool that already checks to see how valid their APIs are. So if you can validate your API endpoint against automatically against the expected output, then interoperability shouldn't really be a problem.
Devin?
I mean, I think that if the question is what is HSDS, what's the minimum, I think it should be a data package or a service.json. And then if we want to kind of go for the extended, I would say it's all of it, including a data package that you can access at a predefined endpoint and a organization JSON as well. So I'd say in my little proposal down here, It's the greens, either one of the greens would do it for you. And if you want to do all of it, then do the yellow as well. I don't know the value of the tabular.json files. And it seems like tabular.json is like a additional layer of standard on top that may or may not be of use.
My question, because I thought, Devin, I thought you were the proponent of, say, having like an organization.
I'm definitely a
focused on-
proponent of having an organization, but I also I know from my work, it's definitely useful and it's something we would use. But I also recognize that for the UK folks, organization isn't really as useful. So I don't see why they would have to do it. But I think that the whole point of this whole thing is certainly, you know, services, right? Like surfacing services, in which case, you know, I would say a service list would be the minimum.
But
I would just suggest that I would only access it via organization, even if I wanted the services, because it's a more efficient transfer of information. There's going to be less duplication that way. So that's my only feedback on that. Even if I want the services.
I agree that the organization, the reason why organization is good is exactly what Skylar said. And if you start thinking about how am I going to dedupe data, multiple data sources, all that, you know, it comes down really to organization being a key element of that, even though very few end users are actually looking for organizations, they're looking for services.
Right.
Yep.
it's also a very trivial one to, if you wanted a transformation, moving the organization one to a service is very easy. It's like you just have to, you could, if you say I made a validation tool at the service level, it'd be fairly easy just to manipulate the organization one to a service level one with the organization duplicated, and that would be good enough as like a tool. So, but the argument, I suppose the question I've got is it okay just to produce the organization one? If that was what people, are we going to limit people?
Yeah, the reason why I don't like that is because sometimes, particularly in more chaotic situations or in maybe more grassroots situations, like the organization is kind of unknown. You know, like if it's like a food distribution point, you know, it's like who actually put this food distribution point together? It's like I don't know. You know,
Fair.
like it might just be. It might be that church, it might be 3 churches teaming up, it might be, is it the state, is it the local government, is it the federal government? It can get all confusing. So I think for that's why I think centering service is service should be the minimum.
Yeah, but the question is it okay if somebody does have an organization to only produce the organization one, if they're the publisher, to say, oh, I don't want to do a service level one because it's difficult for me to do it? Then is that okay? I don't know that.
It probably should be. Maybe it should be. Yeah, I'm open to that. Thinking that.
So so out of the list that I've put through down there, is there any? Would you say if anybody did any of them, is that valid? Does that sound reasonable? If any of those points, not just like what is it, would we stop them from just producing one of those? I mean, we could argue that.
I think the tabular. I don't know about the tabular.json. Someone else has to speak to the value of that. I don't understand it really.
Was that David? Is that your? Is that the array of table definitions that Skylar was?
Yeah. I produced something that I thought the Skylar wanted for that
Well,
one.
it originally came from conversations online between me and Devin and Mike, which was just along the lines of, if I want to hit an endpoint, you know, and get a machine readable definition of HSDS 3.0, not the APIs, but just the, you know, table schema, if you will, then I'd like to have those in one endpoint instead of hitting all the separate ones. It's a minor convenience issue. But we were all kind of like, yeah, if I could hit one endpoint and just get a dictionary back, I'd love to. And so that's where that came from.
And I think we're saying it could be supported and we can supply the schemas for it, which is good. So if people want to do it, but it's like, are we going to say that that's valid only to have that is the question.
Well, that defines the schema. It doesn't transmit data. To me, that's a documentation tool, not a transform tool, or not a transfer tool. So I would take that off the table.
Okay.
For this conversation.
Okay.
Okay, I'm glad I didn't understand that. That's what I just wanted to feel clarity on when that was mentioned, but that's good.
But Skylar, before you try to wrap this up, you and I had talked about this. Has this conversation answered your question about whether the schema will be fully nested in JSON or an array of table definitions? You and I had spoken about that. Maybe you can recap that discussion and see where we are on that.
Well, it's been settled by what Dave is proposing, which is any of these is valid. So,
Okay.
because there's different levels of like what's canonical. There's the question of what's canonical for defining the specifications. Then there's the question of what's canonical for validating them or moving data around, and that's what we're actually talking about now. And David's proposing like when it comes to actually moving that data around, any of these is valid. We're not saying thou shalt move data in only one way in order to be valid HSDS or HSDA. So
Okay.
that just obviates the whole question. It's like, well, use any one of these.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that I completely agree. That's what I was trying to express in like other things not very well, which is why I've done it in this way, which is great. I think that's good. So I do have like a set of questions. Like we've agreed, are there any things that are not in that list that I've missed out on that you think should be like a thing that that people could publish in a specific way that we'd say also is valid? The only thing that I can think of is a data package not a full data package, just individual CSV files that don't have the data package of JSON. Is that an acceptable endpoint as long as it's called the name of the table? They don't have to produce the data package of JSON with it. That's the only other one that I can think of. Is there any other sort of that I've missed in this list that I'd like to hear?
I think, do we like an API endpoint for the data package?
I do.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that would be, I think it's super easy, if you're producing an API and you're producing a data package, might as well
Make
just
it
like
available.
make it available and clear how to get it.
Yeah, agreed. That sounds good to me.
And I don't know, I mean,
It would add more more kind of overhead in creating an API though. I mean,
yeah.
I don't think you have to do it. It's just like you can if you want to. I mean, that's the
okay. Yeah,
It's
sorry,
like
I've got into all this quite late, so I've been to a lot of these meetings. So,
yeah.
Yeah, optional recommendation kind of thing.
Yeah, because you really, a lot of the people doing this are going to be voluntary organizations and stuff like that, aren't they? So they're going to have a very small budget.
Yeah, I really think a lot of them aren't going to be providing APIs at all. They're just going to be publishing data packages. The small ones in the US, that's all the further they can go.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Just to give you some context for like other standards we deal with, we allow people. It's not a data package, but we have a CSV representation which we allow people to publish that we do convert to the JSON version for the validation tooling. But the data package is obviously fine as well. I'm not suggesting we to come up with another CSV representation that works for this particular case. We've already got the data package, but yeah, that's how other standards deal with this. They don't, yeah, but they allow like individual CSV files to be reduced with the right name and the right fields, and that's good enough as well. As long as the tooling can convert it to the JSON, it's fine.
That's fair. That's cool.
Okay. So it sounds like there's some consensus among the folks on this call. Obviously, we'll have to get input from the broader work group and the broader community. But David, do you think you have what you need now to wrap this proposal up so it can be brought to the group with maybe some overview of like, the trade-offs and the key questions?
I think so. I think we've covered that. I don't think there's any. I think, yeah, there's in this group there's like genuine, like it seems all fine.
Okay.
Okay. The downsides are that when we talk about the one question that I've got is that the API specification currently says the doc says when you're having an API with a service, you also need to have quite a lot of other things as well. It sort of says you need a taxonomy endpoint and other things, and it's I think that I worry about being too much like HSDA in that, where you're requiring too much. So when we get into the API doc stuff later, then we need to like say, I think we need some to change that a little bit, because this proposal is slightly different from what's in the API specification doc.
Okay. All
I
right.
have an edge case. I have an edge case. I'm still thinking over David's question of like, did we miss any other ways that this stuff gets moved around? And I've got one, and I just don't know if it's relevant to any of this, but maybe it needs to be mentioned as being like allowable technically, just for somebody who's curious. We're replicating databases at the SQL level, you know, or however you want to define that, dump and put it into another database. And then to validate that, we, you know, essentially write SQL validators that, you know, just run on the database and confirm that all the foreign keys are correct, uniqueness is correct, the shape of the tables, you know, the columns that are expected are present, that kind of stuff. So that kind of falls outside the scope of all of this. You know, in our case, we're usually using a package called DBT to run those checks. That's one of the things it can do, is just validate all of those relationships at the database level. So we run it after we've replicated the database into our database, and we run that and do all the validation that way. That is different. Probably really up to the implementation. It depends on the databases you're working with. But that's another use case that we're using for, I don't know, 2 or 3 different 2-in-1s. So
yeah, so that's an interesting, because every database you could say ANSI standard insert statements is another representation for your database. I mean, they're pretty uniform, but you may not cover all databases within that. Because they all have they're all slightly different, annoyingly, at some like, yeah. But I don't know whether we should have that as like an option that we can give to people. Actually, as part of the standard now, we do let you produce like the examples in terms of a SQLite or Postgres database. I think we've already got the code to do that. That can generate the schemas for you. Well,
yeah. Peter used that SQL, that script for his database to set it up and do validation. So
yeah,
definitely.
so I think we're going to be keeping that anyway, but it's whether we allow that as a valid representation, like is that all, if that's okay, that's the only thing people produce. I think that's a bit limiting for like public consumption though, to just have the insert version of it.
Yeah, certainly can be, but maybe documentation just mentions that like, hey, we recognize sometimes you just replicate databases as long as it conforms in validation to this SQL file that we've produced, like, you know, be assured it is HSDS.
Yeah, I think a SQL element would be super useful. I mean, my dream would be that we have, you know, a reference SQL that we can just dump whatever it is. It's like dump whatever you get. If it can go into that SQL, you're an HSDS, and we have an API, a reference API that just plugs into that SQL, and it's like, you know, and that is kind of the core, the core reference implementation, basically, which anyone, you know, you could start off with.
Agreed.
I mean, it'd be excellent if the profiles could then make a limited version of that and it would still work at some point. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the question, I guess, is just like, I mean, I think people, you know, we've discussed similar things, you know, I think we've discussed that in the past, and the question is just, where does the standard implementation end, and just that become a tool, like a reference tool?
I think we sort of, as a data publication thing, you sort of, I would slightly balk at that being the only way that you've published that data. The insert statement for a particular database feels a bit worrying to me, but
right.
That's fair. Yeah, no, I think you pretty well nailed that. It's not a publishing technique or tool. It's more for internal use. So it is starting to run behind the scenes for enterprise sharing tools like our federation systems, though. You know, organizations are going to be interacting in basically one of 2 ways. They're streaming data in via APIs, or they're batching it in via replication, which is, so it's becoming a fairly viable use case for like, we still need to validate that this data is HSDS, because although this isn't the point where it's being shared, it's going to be shared after this point. So, yeah.
Okay.
Alright.
Thanks, everyone. I think there's clarity there. But yeah, there is. I think we sort of agreed that, and Devin's changes seem good, and we can propose this as to the rest of the group when. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah, I mean,
great.
and this seems kind of like it, right? I mean, after this, what else? What is there except kind of zooming in on API conventions that Mike authored? Is that right?
Yeah, that's the next stage, to look at that document in the context of what we've just talked about here, because there are some changes there, and then and I think the question of like JSON representation schema stuff is covered by this, and we don't really need to go there as another question. If this is all agreed, then that was another thing we're going to raise, but I think this covers that, which is great. Yeah.
Okay. So what you're saying is that though we've been only asymptotically approaching the API conversation, we've now actually begun it, and now we can get into the final conventions pertaining to the API protocols. Okay.
Yeah.
Woo. Okay, cool. So David, you're gonna write this up into the next layer of our proposal. Maybe leaving some room for us to be asking questions about what we think we have landed on here, but like, let's open up space for other people to weigh in, just in case there are perspectives that were missed here. So let's develop proposals, but like, we think, given this, we think that, but what do others think X, Y, or Z, right? Something like that. And David, I'm happy to follow up with you and work on that with you.
Yeah.
We have Mike's proposal document, which I think outlines much, if not all, of the remaining issues with regards to the API protocols. So it sounds like we might be turning to that for the topic for our next conversation. One thing I want to mention, we had skipped a week, and now we're on a different alternating day, or different alternating week. I wonder if, David, how long will it take you to compile this and get, the next iteration of the proposal? Because I wonder if we might actually try to get back on track next week.
I think that should be fine if I'm got time.
Okay.
This week I'll be working Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. So if you want to help me get that together for next Monday, that'd be great.
So we could try to potentially, I can see if will everybody be more available next Monday? If that happens, we might even be able to get a final meeting before the end of the year, 2 weeks after that. And it sounds like maybe we could close the year, maybe not having dealt with all the tooling, but having walked right up to it.
That'd be great.
Okay.
Can't wait for 3.0 to drop.
All right. Any final notes, folks? I will make a note to see if we can reschedule or get a complete working group meeting back on the books for next week, at which David will come with he will synthesize the outputs of this conversation into a proposal that we'll be able to review and provisionally approve. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks all. Cheers.
Thanks. Great work.
All right. Bye-bye.
Great job, David.